Are we? Ready to rock and roll? All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Athena Small, Associate Professor of Economics here at KSC. It's my privilege and honor today to introduce, or rather to reintroduce, us to Jeyson Stennley and him to us. Jeyson Stennley is the Jacob Erowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, and did his training in the Department of Linguistics and Cognitive Science at MIT, who's notable for a number of things. We did these we're going to make a very abbreviated introduction today because many of you have heard it, but he's the author of several books recently focusing on the rise of fascism, including the recently published How Fascism Works, which I believe you'll be doing an event for this Thursday at, I believe, 4 p.m. Is that right? Sorry, at 5:30 p.m. So I'm going to, in lieu of, where he went to kindergarten kind of introduction, I'm going to talk a little about a segue from his talk yesterday. His talk yesterday was wide-ranging and interdisciplinary, so I can't summarize it, but one of the themes was the importance of historical narratives or national narratives for the coherence and identity of a community and also of a nation. And one of the things that I found striking about this, coming as an economist and coming he to us as a community, many of whom focuses on economics, is how missing these concepts are from the economic models that we study, that we develop, and that we teach to you. The idea is of an historical narrative being central to your identity just doesn't come up in the basic stories that we tell about how humans behave and what motivates them. And so there's something really powerful and important, I think, missing in the stories that we teach you and that we tell ourselves. And the stories, I think, that motivated, for example, the embrace of a neoliberal order in the 1990s that ignored national narratives and said those things don't matter much. That's just a kind of entertainment, or it's archaic. It's this kind of epiphenomenon. The real stuff is about capital and labor and trade flows and currency exchange rates, and that's what real men do. And we learned the hard way, whoops, that's not, we blew it. In failing, in presenting global economic policy that failed to think about national narratives. One of the narratives of national identity. And I'll, in that point, close by noting, or pass the torch by noting a question that came up yesterday. The question was about, I'll summarize, do people really need do they need civil rights? Do they need human rights? Do they need a national narrative? Or is it okay, is it good enough if they have economic freedom? And the question was posed in the context of Singapore, which is by many accounts not a very free place in the sense of, culturally, but it's a very free place in terms of your economic opportunities. And maybe that's good enough for human flourishing or whatever it is that we say we want. And Jeyson Stennley noted the same question has arisen in African-American intellectual history between, in particular, two principal players, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a fierce advocate for the political rights and political claims of African Americans, contrasted with Booker T. Washington, who said, we don't really need that. What we need is focuses on our economic opportunities and making money. I'm going to note that may have sounded pretty good. I would suggest that latter narrative died or should have died in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma had one of a huge community of African Americans that had really bought into the Booker T. Washington vision of economic freedom as what we're going to work on. It was very, very thriving black community, lots of black business owners and entrepreneurs and all this great stuff. And then one day, the white community of Tulsa turned and attacked the black community of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and essentially destroyed it. 300 buildings were burned to the ground. And it turned out, let's say, that those economic freedoms were not enough to assure the human flourishing of that black community in the face of a white community that had a very different political narrative. And with that, I hope to challenge our speaker, Jayson Stенley. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Athena. Great to be back. Athena, okay. So I'm going to summarize last time because many of you weren't here, but I'm going to begin with a point that in authoritarian countries, there are no liberal arts colleges. There are no universities that are sort of, there are no universities with free inquiry. So whenever you have an attack on democracy, you can expect an attack on the universities. Right before I came here, I was surfing the web, as one does, and I saw that J.D. Vance, a senator from Ohio who graduated from Yale University, was on TV saying that he was going to follow Viktor Orban in what he did to the universities. What Viktor Orban did is he accused Central European University of being anti-Hungarian. He said they were spreading gender ideology and cultural Marxism. Now Viktor Orban has been incredibly impactful on the American right-wing party, on the Republican Party. And so J.D. Vance said, we're going to imitate that. And whenever that happens, you know authoritarianism is coming. So that should just be, it should just be the importance of our topic of education can be kind of summarized by that, right? There are no liberal arts colleges in authoritarian countries. So now, what we're trying to do and what I'm trying to do in my work in this newest book that is coming out in September is try to figure out the distinction between a democratic education and an authoritarian education. Now, you might be inclined to say, drawing on Athena's remarks, that a democratic education is a capitalist education. A democratic education is an education for job skills, an education for capitalism, that freedom is free markets. And I think what you see, I think there are numerous reasons to disagree with that. First of all, if you just have free markets, what are you going to do with people who can't participate in free markets? Disabled people, for example, senior citizens. Do you just let them die? This is, and once you start to ask the question of why we take care of each other in a country, you fairly quickly see that we take care of each other because we have bonds that go beyond a free market. We have connections that go beyond, connections of care and connections of concern that go beyond just each other as economic agents. And so what my question is what is that realm of concern where it doesn't devolve into, we're the greatest, we're the most awesome people on earth, and we should, we deserve to be better than everybody. So how can we make sense of a community where we identify and support each other? We distinguish between that and something like, white nationalism or Russian imperialism. So now, furthermore, if we're talking about a democratic education, we're talking about an education that nourishes freedom. So you might think, okay, the way to bond us together is to tell the same story, to give each other the same traditions, and to say everybody has to have those traditions. You must have those traditions. But that's not freedom. It's not free to be told that a bunch of dead people tell you what to do, and you have to do what dead people tell you. That is not democracy. That is not a society that is free, where you have to do what dead people tell you. In fact, the whole idea of a liberal arts education is to learn to challenge traditions. That doesn't mean abandon traditions, because you can freely decide to adopt them. So we talked in the last class about what do you do with traditions that, say, are oppressive to women. We cannot forget, as intersectional feminism tells us, that you can't make the call that all women should do this. I told you what intersectional feminists, what Muslim feminists would say. They were like, we're wearing a hijab, but you Western women have to wear makeup and lipstick and pay a lot for your, so actually you're less free. So you can't make decisions for other people. You have to leave people the freedom to decide whether to take on traditions, and you can't judge for them when their traditions are oppressive to them. However, in a democracy, they also must have the freedom to not adopt those traditions. So there's all these complexities in a democratic society. And so the question we have is, how do you have, one question we have is, how do you construct an education that does that? That allows people to adopt the traditions of their ancestors or someone else's traditions, but is tolerant of all different ways of going. What we talked last time about colonialist education, what happens when one country colonizes another. And I took one example that I talked about at length last year in my lectures, but I'm going to raise again, and that's what the British did to Kenyan schools. They said, everyone has to speak English. If you get caught speaking your tribal language, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan philosopher, says in the 1950s, when he went to the elite school in Kenya, Alliance High School, if you were caught speaking Kikuyu, his native language, you had to wear a sign saying, "I am a donkey," for the whole day. So you had to speak English. They tried to drive the Kikuyu identity out. They Christianized everybody. Everybody had to become Christian. The traditional religions were extinguished because they thought civilization was being Christian. And they tried to focus on extinguishing the identity and make people into little British people. Then we talked about indigenous education in the United States. The motto of the Carlisle School was, "Kill the Indians, save the man." So the idea was to completely extinguish any kind of identity that you had from your background and replace it by a white Christian person. So that's indigenous education. So So that's what colonial education is you stamp out the local identity. You stamp out the local language. You stamp out the local identity. So today, and then you replace it by a single narrative. There are certain things you say how many people were here last week, yesterday again? Raise your hand. Okay, good, that's several of you. So you stamp out the local identity, and you say, and you represent that group as having no history. You say, no, there's no history they have. We're the only people with a history. So now having a history means there's a course through history that defines who you are, who your group is. If you're told you have no history, then you're told your group really never existed. Now, it's not like the British were saying the Kikuyu or the Luo or the Kamba or the Kalenjin or any one of the 40-plus tribes in Kenya never existed. But they wanted to say that before the British came, they had no history. They had no civilization. They didn't really exist. But no two colonial situations are the same. And you could imagine a colonial situation, I don't know if you could imagine this, where there is a group that has its own distinctive path through history, and the colonialism takes the form of saying, you have no distinctive path through history, the only path through history is our path, and you're part of that path, but there's no distinct thing that is your path. That's another way of saying that group has no history. Right. So those are the features of colonialist education. You try to give one perspective, the perspective of the colonizing group. Ngugi wa Thiong'o notes that a familiar thing, actually my father who studied Kenya, that's why I have an unusual amount of knowledge of British colonialism in Kenya. My father wrote his dissertation there from 1959 to 1962, studying the schools. His dissertation was called Origins of Change, the British Schools and the Making of the East African Intellectual. So it was, that has deeply affected me, my father's work generally. So he notes in his work that Kenyan students, Kikuyu students who he was studying, knew everything about Europe. They could list all the European royal families dating back hundreds of years. And they were scholars. They'd taken years of European history, but they knew nothing about the country they lived in. Now, the country was artificial. African countries were created in the scramble for Africa in the Berlin Conference of 1884. And so the country lines in Africa are completely artificial. The post-Habsburg country lines in Europe are not so artificial because they go along with with languages. Because the first form of nationalism is linguistic nationalism. Of course, nationalism is a 19th century thing. 500 years ago, you were all living under kings, and you would be, if you were asked your identity, you're saying my identity is that's my king or that's my ruler, and nobody thought I'm different from other people who are in this kingdom. But then in the 19th century, people were like, oh no, Ukrainians and Polish people are different. It doesn't matter because we speak different languages. And Fichte came in the early 19th century and said, when Napoleon was invading, and said, no, they're French. And even though Bavarians and Prussians used to be different, we're all the same because we all speak German, and that's a superior language. So nationalism is a 19th century thing. It was not something that was known to before that. It's not a formation that comes before the 19th century. You guys, all of you caused the the breakup of the poor Habsburg Empire, because suddenly they found, I forgot which Habsburg emperor sent all of his kids to the different Habsburg nations, the nations that were rising. So one became the Polish leader, one became the Ukrainian leader, one became, so he was like, okay, I see what's happening. Let's make sure we stay in control. Timothy Snyder's book, The Red Prince, is about the sort of first Ukrainian national leader, who was an interesting fellow, who I recommend that book. So nationalism is a form of identity that comes after monarchy and is connected to language, religion. The Nazis had nationalism based on race, right? And Americans had nationalism based on race. But Ukrainians didn't have nationalism based on race. Poles didn't have nationalism based on race. But they could all still be pretty brutal. So what we're going to now ask is, what is a nationalist education? And then I want to ask what a fascist education is. And all the while, I want us to have in the background this concept of a democratic education. What kind of education, which I think is the kind of education you want? Like, I'm pro-democratic education. But we have to be careful that a democratic education is not misidentified. For example, with a neoliberal education, just learning job skills. Clearly, that leaves people with a kind of emptiness, and it destroys societies. And what resulted from the 1990s, I think the 1990s was one of the most heinous decades in Eastern Europe ever, because so many people starved to death, right, or died of alcoholism. People were miserable in the 1990s. And then I think that gave rise to fascism, like Russian fascism, because people were like, anything but this, like give us some identity, give us, we're all starving to death and drinking ourselves to death, and oligarchs are just like, some people are making billions and billions of dollars by seizing everything. This capitalism thing is not working for us. And so when that happens, people seize on fake identities. I mean, all identities are fake. There's no real identity. People make shit up. And but there's some fine ways of making shit up, and other ways that result in deeply problematic structures. So that's what we're going to talk about. What are the fine ways of making shit up, and what are the dangerous ways of making shit up? Fichte, when he declares the German nation a nation, is completely making up that Prussians and Bavarians are the same people. For hundreds and hundreds of years, they did not regard each other as the same people. They had different armies, they had different courses through history. But Napoleon is invading. So you better make a distinction, and you can't just with the Bavarians beat the French army. You need everybody together, so you make up this fake identity, and that's kind of okay. Like, you try to fit both the Catholics and the Protestants together, right? I mean, when you're putting together the, quote, German nation, unquote, you're putting together Catholics and Protestants. And that's kind of two people with two groups, two religions that do not have the same history. So it's all made up. I remember saying to Tim Snyder, what's crazy about Rwanda, so the Rwandan genocide, is that there is no difference between the Hutu and the Tutsi. Like, the Hutu and the Tutsi are the same goddamn people. Africa is where all humanity comes from, so it's the most diverse continent in the world. The smartest person in the world lives in Africa. The least smart person in the world lives in Africa. It's just like unbelievably diverse. Like, I remember one time a white friend of mine was like, well, they're saying the European soccer teams, football teams are not diverse, but look at the Cameroonian team. They're not diverse. And I was like, there are 11 different groups of people, 11 different languages in that team. You know, of course, they're much more diverse than the French team. So every, you know, Congo has 150 different groups, and they're really different. You know, different practices, different religions, different histories. So now here's the thing about the Hutu and Tutsi. They have the same language, the same religion, so they're the same people. And yet the same people, the Belgians made a big distinction between them. The Belgians decided these are the attractive people, the Tutsi, and these are the less attractive people, the Hutu. And there were some differences. They're within the same tribe, same religion, but there wasn't really a caste difference. It's that there were different roles each group played within the tribe. Like some people were the farmers, and I don't know exactly what the different, but they had different functional roles within society. So the Belgians decided they were two different tribes, and so they created this distinction between them, and then the distinction sort of lasts. But we're talking the 1950s. So this group of people that were the same group of people that spoke the same language and had the same religion were divided into two, and they started to have different histories. And then that results in a genocide where one group kills 500 to 800,000 of another group in several months. This is the 30th anniversary of the genocide, by the way. And I said to Tim Snyder, what's crazy about this is that they're the same group. They have, it's just completely made up, the distinction between Hutus and Tutsis. And Tim said, Jason, all nationalism is made up. It's all made up. I was like, oh yeah. So, but, you know, but I think that if you look, you know, I have not made my mind up about nationalism as a construct. I think you cannot have neoliberalism. People seek meaning when they just are made into commodity. You know, free markets are not the only kind of freedom. They're not even freedom. You know, in order to be free, you need a whole bunch of stuff like healthcare. Like, you know, if you don't have, if you're in debt, if you owe, like we do in America, hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs for your education, you can't do whatever you want. You have to just earn money, right? Debt is a kind of unfreedom. And in capitalism, you're going to acquire a lot of debt. And so that's unfreedom. In capitalism, you need to work for money, and you're unfree in the workplace. So we need some other kind of structure underlying democracy that gives us freedom. Now, and that also tells you, when you think about democratic institutions, I've already suggested that schools and universities are democratic institutions. You do not have liberal arts colleges in authoritarian societies. But other democratic institutions are labor unions, and this is a point that comes up again and again and again. Because in a democracy, you want freedom. But in the workplace, you know, without labor unions, you're enslaved to the boss. And so labor unions allow you to have freedom within the workplace. So labor unions are central to democracy. They allow you to still be free within the workplace. So, and I do think that these identities, the national identities, it's new, this concept of national identity, but I think it's a kind of thing that can bring people together in a community that is smaller than a world community. It's just very hard for people to, you know, feel a bond of care with everyone. I mean, you should, but in lieu of that, a national community gives people meaning. And it bonds together, and there are historical paths. There are multiple historical paths. And when you're a human being, your ancestors and the people, often the people around you, share a historical path. And having that be forbidden to you, as happens under colonialism, is a restriction of your freedom, because you can't have the historical path. The historical path of your family is not allowed. So, and then the historical path of another group is forced upon you. And I think an example of this, a particularly harsh example, is when a language is forced upon you. When a language is forced upon you, you're really, words have histories, and you're being forced to take up someone else's history. Ngugi wa Thiong'o in 1986, he's a very famous African novelist, writing in English, wrote many famous novels. And then in 1986, he wrote this book, Decolonizing the Mind, where he declared he will never write anything in English again. He will only write in Kikuyu. I gave a talk at the sort of city cultural center in Barcelona, which is, 600 people, just people come just because they're interested in culture. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o sells it out every time, and he gives his lectures in Kikuyu with a Catalan translator. So must be only like one, right? But he's so popular in Catalonia because they're fighting a national fight for their language, and not to endorse Catalan nationalism. I think, that's an example that can bring some hazards, like in Catalonia, the Catalan nationalists, in the high schools, Spanish is only taught as a foreign language 2 hours a week. And that's kind of you can have extremes of, there's just a lot of people who are Spanish who live in Barcelona and don't want their kids to grow up. So Catalan nationalism can be a bit restrictive and problematic and oppressive. So what is an acceptable form of nationalist education versus what is a unacceptable form? I think even though nationalism is tied to language, there are going to be different groups within a nation. And so you can look at the nation, different religious groups. This is obvious even from Fichte, right? Because he's saying it's a German nation because they all speak German, even though there's both Catholics and Protestants who've been killing each other for a very long time because they're Catholics. They have a different version of Christianity. But he's saying they're the same nation. It's still okay for there to be Catholics and Protestants, Fichte thinks, but they're superior because they all speak German, which is the inherited language, the Greek and then Latin and then German. Well, actually it's Greek then German. The Latin is, he says, the Latin languages are inferior. But so the true American nationalism, they say the founders are the ones who are, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are the rightful inheritors of the Greek and Roman traditions. And, that's a dangerous kind of nationalism. That's essentially white nationalism. White nationalism says there's a long white tradition and in fact, this is what the Nazis thought. The Nazis, because frankly, the Germans were barbarians living in the north during antiquity, right? and the Roman Empire, So what the Nazis did is they said, well, really, the greatest Roman emperors were really German. And the Greeks really were German. So the Nazis, and this is official part of this was Nazi education. And so really, all the great things were done by Germans. I hope Timoty Snyder is not watching this, but he's kind of trying to do this with Ukrainians. Congratulations on Yusek, though. Usyk. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but your boxing champion. The first time I came to Ukraine in 2017, I was saying, well, it'd be ludicrous to say the Ukrainians are the greatest people on earth. And someone said, have you heard of boxing? And have you heard of the Klitschkos? But at any rate, this is a dangerous form of national. I think what you see with the Nazis is white nationalism. They're saying that it's the same Aryan nationalism. They're saying, Hitler says in Mein Kampf, all cultural products only come from Aryans. So the Greeks were Aryans, the Romans were Aryans, and nobody else contributed to culture and civilization. In the United States, you find the same thing. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington are the true inheritors of the traditions of Greece and Rome. And so there's a kind of American Nazism. American white supremacy. So this idea of, a white tradition that lasts back to antiquity is something that one has to be very careful of. Of course, it's a complete myth. They didn't make racial differences in Athens. As my kids said, their mother said, I was reading them Thucydides when they were younger, and they were talking about slavery at dinner, and their mother said, who the slaves were? They were black people. And the kids were like, no, in Greece, everyone got to be a slave. So they didn't make racial distinctions. Race is a construct generally agreed to come from the Enlightenment as a way of giving a biological justification for racial slavery. Okay, so the question is, one of the questions I want to ask is, what is an acceptable versus a not acceptable form of nationalism? Now, it can't be that acceptable nationalism is based on just truth, and unacceptable nationalism is based on lies, because all identities are fake, so all identities are based on lies. So if you're pretending that, if you're pretending that the Bavarians, if you're saying that the Bavarians and that, German-speaking Catholics and German-speaking Protestants have the same history, you're wrong. That's an absurd comment. But when you're creating a national identity, they did leave out Jewish people, but when you're creating a national identity, you have to make certain myths up. So, and there are sort of acceptable myths and not acceptable myths. And since nationalism so easily tilts into dangerous myths that can result in oppressing people, and the dangerous myths since they accentuate, they involve saying, well, we have the same traditions, and we have to preserve these traditions. They can tilt into patriarchy, because in the past, there was a lot of patriarchy. I don't know if you've heard that. I hear some of it is still around. And so nationalism does tend to go along with patriarchy, because you're saying in the past things were this way, and we should continue that. So nationalism of necessity creates, it has these elements of history, the same history, like, take Ukrainian nationalism. I don't want to say Ukrainian nationalism has a bad ring to it, but take Ukrainian identity. It is true that Ukrainians have a distinct path through history than Russians. Ethnic Russians did not face Holodomor. They didn't face a famine and a genocide. Now, Ukrainians weren't the only Soviet citizens to face a famine. To face that famine. There were other groups of Soviets, but the Russians weren't. It's like Stalin directed it explicitly against Ukrainians. So that's part of being Ukrainian, is coming from that past, and it's not part of being Russian, though it is part of being, there were other parts, there were other non-ethnic ethnic Soviets that Stalin directed that famine to as well. So when when you want to erase a distinctive Ukrainian identity, you'll erase Holodomor, right? Because, Holodomor is targeted against certain ethnic groups, including centrally the people who died the most were Ukrainians. So if you say, as the Russian textbooks do, there was a famine in the 30s, and the famine was due to administrative errors, and and a lot of Soviet citizens died, then you're erasing the targets. Natalia Gumaniuk texted me. Okay. So how do we distinguish between erasures that are problematic, deeply problematic, and erasures that are, or myths that are deeply problematic, and myths that are okay? It is okay, a myth that is okay, a myth that there is one group of people and they've all had the same history. Well, that's not true. Like, the people who spoke Ukrainian, there were differences between them. There were a lot of Jewish people. It was the second most Jewish people of any country in the world were Ukrainian. It's like the home of one of the largest branches of Judaism. So there were a lot of Jewish people who spoke Ukrainian. There were a lot of Christian people. And so you don't want to associate, when you're doing the Ukrainian identity, it would be wrong to exclude the fact that Ukraine was a multi-religious place. Unlike many other places, and the variety of religions. It wasn't just a minor thing. It's like, when you're in Brooklyn, there's a lot of Ukrainians, and so my grandparents spoke Ukrainian. They spoke Ukrainian in the household when they didn't want my mother and my aunt to understand them. That was the language they spoke. So they were from the Ukrainian-Polish border. So an acceptable myth is one that's inclusive. It identifies, it celebrates a past of diversity while recognizing a common history. And it recognizes in its education the bad parts. Because a dangerous kind of myth says we were never bad, we were always good. We were totally innocent and we were only victims. Don't do that. In the United States, that's very powerful. They're trying to ban essentially black history. So like the Tulsa riot, where they killed the whole Tulsa, or they killed most of the Tulsa the black upper class, and wiped out their existence. There's lots of other instances of take what Belgium did in Congo. There were very few discussions of the fact that Belgians killed 10 million people in a few years, and then until the 1990s. Hannah Arendt remarkably notices it in Chapter 7 of Origins of Totalitarianism, but it isn't really discussed among white people. And actually, at the time, there was a black American journalist who went to the Congo and reported back on what was happening. So So that's an example. I mean, 10 million dead, and they weren't just killed. They would cut the hands off little kids, all the little kids in the village, if the village didn't meet the rubber quota. So all the pictures of that time have kids without hands. And this was the French fry people, right? The Belgians. They've given us French fries. You know, you don't think, like in the 80s, you didn't think of the Belgians that way. And last time I told you about the fact that in my childhood, we were told there were only 1 million indigenous people, you know, and so therefore, you know, 1 million indigenous people in North America, but in fact there were 82 million. So since there were 82 million, you know, you're erasing a genocide of a lot of people. So those erasures of, and we talked yesterday, about how we keep those histories alive. How is it that, you know, and how is it that it's very hard to erase histories of genocide? Holodomor was, quote unquote, rediscovered, right? It became again a thing, a concept. In Eastern Europe, the Holocaust was erased. The idea was that they were just killing Soviet citizens. So they didn't talk about the fact that, you know, 93, you know, like some enormous percentage of Jewish people in Eastern Europe were killed, like over 90% in Poland. I don't know what the number is in Ukraine, but probably similar, right? So that wasn't an isolated concept under Soviet education. Holodomor was not an isolated concept under Soviet education. And that enabled people to erase those histories. So last time we talked about how to erase histories in problematic ways. You can erase concepts, you can erase perspectives, and you can erase histories, things that happened, like the Tulsa 1921 race riot. Do we call it a riot? Massacre, we call it a massacre, right? The Tulsa 1921 Tulsa 1921 massacre, where they massacred the upper middle class, the black population. So that was erased, like we never learned about it in school in the 1980s, wasn't a thing. So nationalism involved, so we're talking about what a healthy nationalism is and what an unhealthy nationalism is. And we have to see that both involves myth-making. Like, it isn't the case that, you know, it's true that, you know, it's going to be problematic to say that to be Ukrainian, just to take an example, is just to be, you know, Christian in this particular way that Ukrainians are. That would be problematic because you're erasing a history that should be that of a multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. Crimean Tatars, like all the different parts of, you know, Crimea is Ukraine. And so a healthy democracy celebrates a diverse past, while saying there's a similar history. And that's a tricky balance, right? And then you do not want to say we were just victims. You want to remember the bad, like a healthy American nationalism would talk a lot about indigenous genocide, slavery, and its effects, and Jim Crow, which was the racial fascist regime in the United States that lasted very long. So long that June 8th is Loving Day, which was when the Supreme Court finally decided that it's illegal for states to ban marriages between black and white people. So that my children are legal. And that was 1967, which is kind of late. So a bad American history would be erasing all of that. It would be saying, okay, there was slavery, but then we solved it. We had the Civil War, and the black intellectual tradition is always fighting for true history to be remembered. So when the Civil War is taught, it was taught, I mean, this was a standard, the way I learned it, it was like, white Americans decided to end slavery. And white Americans had this big thing, this big war, and they ended slavery, and the black Americans were grateful. One time when I was teaching in prison, one of the students was like, I stopped going to school as soon as they told me I owed everything to Abraham Lincoln, who was the Union leader and the president of the Union. So now, W.B. Du Bois, the one we've already discussed, he wrote this book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction. Du Bois wrote many, many books. Here's a crazy thing about W.E.B. Du Bois. He averaged 6,000 words of published work per day for the last 50 years of his life. So Black Reconstruction, one of the many, many, like the Booker T. Washington Du Bois debate is decades before, is 1903. And 1935, 32 years later, he writes this book, he publishes his book, 800-page book called Black Reconstruction, and it's the true history of the Civil War and the post-Civil War era. So right after the Civil War, black people are allowed to vote in the South for 10 years. That's called the Reconstruction, and then the Ku Klux Klan arises, and then black people are no longer allowed to vote until 1965. So that can easily happen. You can have a period of freedom. You can have a period where essentially, the black nation is free, and then just gone for a long time. But then, and that history, those histories of coming back and being gone and coming back and being gone, that's kind of, as long as there was this period of freedom, and then it's there in your memory always to come back. But Du Bois writes this book, Black Reconstruction, that published in 1935. And the standard narrative in the top leading universities is that there's a quote that Du Bois mentions from a historian that Negroes are the only people in history that were freed without lifting a finger to free themselves. And that's the myth that Du Bois is fighting against. And Du Bois shows, first of all, there were 200,000 black soldiers fighting in the Civil War. So that's a lot. And so there were many black regiments, many, see the movie Glory? Also, crucial to the victory was the fact that enslaved people in the South were constantly doing work stoppages and constantly sabotaging the Confederate Army. So, none of that would have been possible without, for a little while in the beginning of the Civil War, when enslaved people escaped to the Union, they were constantly trying to escape to the behind Union lines. The Union Army would send them back to the South to go back into slavery, because we can't take people's property. And then a Union general, I'm forgetting his name, decided that they would seize the property under the rules of war. And they called the enslaved people who escaped behind Union lines contraband, like property that has been somehow taken, and so they were contraband, and then they let them, and then they helped a lot. They cooked, they did all this stuff for the Union Army. And then enslaved people behind the lines in the South were essentially rebelling. They were essentially, they were undermining the production of things for the Confederate Army. Part of the myth that black people are lazy comes from slavery, because like, oh, they won't work until you force them. Yeah, who the hell would work under slavery? Like, I'd be really lazy if I was working for free. So Du Bois, Du Bois is part of a long tradition fighting against fake history. Now, there's a topic that I'm going to talk about, that I'm going to move into, that is less relevant, I think, in Eastern Europe, but quite relevant in the American context and the Western European context, which is the topic of classical education. So that's one chapter in my book. I'm going to move into that later. So a healthy nationalist education would be like, in the American context, would not be one that would associate great American achievements with white people, right? In fact, the cultural production of the United States, I mean, how many of you listen to country music? Anyone? One? Oh, okay, 3 people. What about rap? Right. I mean, there isn't like a town, or jazz. Like, these are all productions of black Americans. So Toni Morrison, our Nobel Prize winner, is one of our probably the most famous post-war American writer. So the culture, but if you said the cultural productions and achievements of America are all white, that would be really problematic, right? And then you would think that all the stuff where you're supposed to look at black history is actually victimizing white people, right? Because white people are innocent. They ended slavery, they did all these great things, and now they're being criticized. We're being criticized for racism. And so we're not innocent. That's a very unhealthy form of nationalism. That's a form of nationalism, where, conceptually, this idea that your nation is innocent makes you think that any claim that you're not innocent, or any claim that some group has been treated badly, is a form of victimizing you. Now, you can see this quite clearly with men, right, who view feminism as victimizing them, right? So if you want to think of it, you can think of patriarchy. Nationalism is an ideology, and patriarchy is like the oldest ideology. Like, that was the first one. Amani Perry calls patriarchy the first ideology. It's like, and it has a distinctive form. It's a different ideology than nationalism, because as Simone de Beauvoir points out, with patriarchy, you're sleeping with the enemy. Whereas with nationalism, you're not. Nationalism, racism involves segregation. Patriarchy does not. So, but they're both ideologies that place one group over another group. So national innocence is a dangerous feature of national innocence. A nationalist education that eliminates all the bad things, that would say eliminates, like in the case of Poland, Jewish people who returned, like my mother and my aunt and my grandparents, when they returned, they were all like beaten up and killed, and it was horrible. And if you erase that, you're erasing, you're creating an image of Polish identity where they're just good. If, Israel erases the fact that they drove 700,000, 50,000 Palestinians out of the land. And then the land was just empty. Well, what happened? We just came here. And so they're innocent. And then you can see now with Gaza what happens when you think you're innocent. I mean, we can also talk about, when we talk about conflicts like that, we can also talk about, unacceptable ways of fighting back, like Hamas is an unacceptable way of fighting back. So just because you're a victim doesn't mean you can kill people's kids and stuff. But both sides are deeply, but national innocence allows you to do terrible things. Russians support the war. Why do they support the war? Because it's part of Russian ideology. I don't want to say, enough of you push back on this that I don't want to say what I used to say, they were lied to, because they lie to themselves. So it's part of Russian ideology that Holodomor didn't really exist. It wasn't directed against Ukrainians, that Ukrainian is little Russian, that Ukrainians are just other Russians and they don't have a separate history. And that means that Ukraine is kind of insult, because there's no, Russia's innocent, Russia contains. The idea that there's a distinct Ukrainian identity is like an insult to an innocent group of people, the Russians. And that really is Russia. And so, and Ukrainian identity is a kind of insult that's saying, okay, we had this identity and you're stomping on it, and you stomped on it, and you oppressed it. And that suggests that the Russians are not innocent. And if you look at Russian textbooks today, they're all about national innocence. They're all about saying, well, we had to go into Ukraine because the CIA started this revolution of dignity, the Maidan, and we had to go into Ukraine because there were these Russians who were being killed. And then we had to go into Georgia because we had to help the separatist movements, the independent freedom fighters. So that's the Russian textbooks. No, we only ever help. And it's very attractive to think that. It's very hard. Like, it's really hard. I mean, I'm not Israeli, but it's still hard for me to be like, okay, there's a terrible thing Jewish people are doing. That's hard. It's hard to say. But that's necessary in order to critique your own, in order to have an identity. It's necessary to be critical of your own identity. I'm not against the existence of the state of Israel by any means, but I'm against, them doing really bad things. And then accepting that a group of people. I mean, I don't really connect I'm American, and part of my American identity is recognizing all the bad shit that my country has done. But that doesn't mean I'm not American. That's a crucial thing about healthy nationalism. It doesn't mean that I hate America, that I recognize there's terrible things that America did. Now, when universities and schools, and this leads us to the next point, when universities and schools are being attacked for being anti-American or anti-Russian, as Putin is doing now. He's attacking universities and schools for being anti-Russian. In India, there's a massive attack on universities for being anti-Indian. What happens is the universities are teaching true history, and any true history of any place or any people is going to involve bad shit, right? Because people suck. And but since bad nationalism says that the nation is innocent, you attack universities and schools that teach students the bad things the nation did. So anytime a university or a school challenges national innocence or national victimhood, it gets attacked. But teaching true history is going to result in that, invariably. So here we can, I think, start to see the outlines between the distinction between nationalism that is okay, or even good, and nationalism that is bad. Nationalism that is bad erases all the bad things in a nation's past. It says there's national innocence, and that any representation of people doing bad things in the past is made up, and then therefore the country is victimized by it.
Personal offense.
What?
Personal offense about that bad thing that happened, and Russians like to be offended when we talk about our past or so on.
Right, yeah, exactly. Because Russian nationalism is bad in that way. So I'm going to talk for like 10 more minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. A good kind of nationalism would be a nationalism where people don't get offended when you say, like, I don't get offended. I do love the United States, and I certainly don't get offended when people are like, but you guys killed a lot of people in Iraq for no reason at all. And every 20 years you seem to pick another group of non-white people to kill, and you probably shouldn't do, and I know that about my country. Vietnam, Iraq, like these were pointless wars in which hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people were killed for no reason whatsoever. But I still am American. There's a long history in America of protests against our country killing lots of people. So there's no issue there. There is no problem at all with identifying yourself as American and being critical of the bad shit America did. In fact, the United States has a long and glorious tradition of people being critical of what the United States did. It's a lot of our literature. It's a lot of our Nobel Prize winners. Toni Morrison writes about the bad shit America did, and she's American. And she's not just American, she's a Nobel Prize winner. She's a brilliant. So there's no tension at all between strong identification with your country and full knowledge and full acceptance of the bad stuff your country did. It's sometimes tough. You can see, I think the one country that did it the best is West Germany. West Germany had a very strong confrontation with its past. And it was very hard. It's psychologically very difficult to be like, Grandpa's a Nazi. That's hard. But it's brave. It's remarkable when people do that. And I'm very impressed by, say, white Americans who are like, yeah, I come from slave owners, and it was horrible. So West German identity became connected to democracy. And so when I lived in West Germany in the 1980s, people strongly identified national identity with democracy. And so they thought of themselves as, protecting democracy, as confronting their past. And they were still Germans, so they still lectured the rest of the world. And were like, we're the best in the world at apologizing. So they're still Germans. So we can teach you how to apologize. But still, it was, they did confront their past in a way that was, but it's so hard. It's so hard. And even within that positive identity, so I went to high school for a year in Germany and college for a year, there were still myths. Like, for example, when I was taught about the Holocaust, they confront people directly with the Holocaust, students directly. They're like, this is what your grandparents did. And however, they have certain myths about it. So in the 80s, they were like, well, there were these death camps like Auschwitz where 1 million Jews were killed. And there were these really bad Germans called the SS, really bad Germans. But no normal Germans knew what was happening. And the Wehrmacht, the German soldiers, they weren't in the concentration camps. And you know the people who did all the killing in the concentration camps? They were those awful Slavs. You know, they put the Slavs in charge of, you know, so it's terrible. So if Auschwitz is the Holocaust, and the sort of capos in Auschwitz were Slavs, and the people were running it were these terrible Germans, the SS, who were kind of not really German, but just devils, then ordinary Germans didn't know about the Holocaust and didn't do it. So that was kind of the myth that West Germans were taught. And like most of my family were shot by German soldiers over pits. They were not killed in, we had like 12 of my relatives were killed in Sobibor, but the rest of them were shot over pits. And this came to be known only in 2010 as the Holocaust of bullets. It was completely unknown in the 1980s. Completely unknown that, I mean, it was kind of known because I knew that most of my family did not die in concentration camps. They were shot. But who did the shooting? You know, so it was ordinary Germans who did the shooting. The Wehrmacht killed 1.5 million Jews, the ordinary soldiers in Poland and Ukraine, by shooting them over pits in a very short time. So, but that was like eliminated because everyone's grandparents were ordinary German soldiers on the Eastern Front. And so if you included that as part of the Holocaust, you'd have to implicate your own grandparents. And so even in the healthiest country in the world that was totally facing its own past, you still lacked these concepts like the Holocaust of bullets that would enable ordinary Germans to understand that they too were implicated. Now I think, you know, I try to stay away from your own history because I'm not an Eastern Europeanist. But to the best of my knowledge, there were Ukrainians in the Soviet Union who were generals. In fact, in the Red Army, some of the great generals who won the war were Ukrainian. And so, and Trotsky's Ukrainian. So those are facts. You know, I don't know. You could say Trotsky was a little Russian in Odessa, but I don't think that's true. You know, so there were Ukrainians in the Soviet Union. And they were part of the Soviet Union, just like everybody else was part of the Soviet Union. And you know, so if Ukrainians say that oh no, we were just fighting the Soviet Union and like that was like we have nothing to do with it, that's false. Now, sometimes Ukrainians have said to me, the Ukrainians in the Red Army were all forced. Well, everyone was forced into the Red Army. That doesn't distinguish the Ukrainians from anyone else in the Soviet Union. Everybody had that. And there were just as many Ukrainians as there were Georgians or whatever. Like, the Soviet Union is everyone's fault. So now, of course, the Soviet Union chose the Ukrainians for special victimhood. You know, they did a genocide of Ukrainians. But still, if you're facing Ukrainian history, it would be weird to say, okay, there was this thing, the Soviet Union, and it had nothing whatever to do with any Ukrainian. And we were just like, it was kind of like slavery, like black Americans and white Americans in the 19th century. It wasn't quite like that. There were no black Americans, you know, who are Confederate soldiers. Now, I don't want to say the Soviet Union was like the Confederacy because the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, which, you know, that's an accomplishment. But Ukrainian history, I'm guessing, would involve, you know, not just national victimhood and national innocence. I mean, there are lots of things that Ukraine did. And you can love Ukraine just as like I love the United States and still say, okay, this is the history. We have one history that binds us together. You know, it's the different and one language. But Ukraine doesn't even have one language, right? Because there are Ukrainians who speak Russian, and so it's complicated. All identities are myths, so even the good ones. But the reason I'm interested in Ukraine is that there's a connection, like with democracy, between Ukrainian identity and democracy. You guys don't want to live under Lukashenko or something. Like, you guys don't like politicians, as far as I can tell, and that's healthy. You want to replace them. So that's a democratic self-identity. Okay, so the final part I was going to talk about is a fascist education. A fascist education is an education where you're told your country is pure. The identity of your country is pure. In the past, there were only one group of people. A version, if there were Ukrainian fascism, it would be like, there were no Jews, or they were extraneous to Ukrainians. Like, it was just, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church back thousands of years, and nobody else was Ukrainian. And we Ukrainian-speaking, Ukrainian Orthodox Christians never did anything bad. And every single historical thing was victim. We were the victims. And we're great, too. And our greatness has been obscured by these misrepresentations. That American fascism would be like, and which we know existed and exists, would be white Christians are American, slavery was bad, but in fact white Christians ended it. The great men of history the great people of history were men. That fascist nationalism always goes with strict gender roles. So this would be the kind of education you'd have, and it's why when countries turn fascist, they attack universities and schools, because in universities and schools they teach the past. So I want to talk about classical education. I don't even know if that's a concept here. Classical education. It's a big concept in the so-called West, because you guys are actually on the other side of classical education. You're on the other side of classical education because y'all are not included. By classical education in the West, well, maybe Tolstoy and Dostoevsky would be included, but it's a particular way of choosing the great authors, like starting with Plato, Aristotle, one or two, maybe Cicero, one or two Romans, and then Kant, and then a lot of Germans, of course. Kant and Hegel. Then you'd throw Shakespeare. The Nazis loved Shakespeare. So what's interesting about talking about this theme that I'm going to end on is you guys are actually, like Black Americans, a victim of this concept of classical education. The reason people don't read Ukrainian authors in American schools is that you're not included in what created the West. So now again and again, what you see is in America is people saying, in fact, there was an op-ed in the New York Times, again, saying we have to return to classical education. So the idea is that there's one set of authors that defines culture. Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare. Who are some others? Anyone? Adam Smith, the economist says. Right, absolutely. Hume, Kant. What? Borges? Yeah, recent, very recent. That's recent. Classical, you can add some to classical education. Cervantes, Don Quixote would be, so we have what? Voltaire, the elements of the Western Enlightenment. And then Dostoevsky and Tolstoy would count. What? Dante, absolutely. So when you take, there's a course at Yale called, it's a sort of like intensive course for a whole year called Directed Studies. And you do the classical philosophy, starting with Aristotle and ending with like Hegel, and then you do the classical literature, you know. I think you read one black person in the whole curriculum, and one Muslim person. Spinoza, you get some Jews in, but very few women. So this is what a classical education is. It's like defined by the things rooted in Plato and Aristotle, and then a lot of Western Europeans. So this is a major topic in the education wars in the United States. Super major. Like, and it's weird talking to a bunch of white people who actually should have the same view as black people in America, which is, wait, you're leaving a lot of people out. You know, so now Du Bois, oddly, is on the wrong side of this. Du Bois argued that everyone should get a classic education, and black people should get a classic education too, and everyone should read Shakespeare and Plato and Aristotle. And of course, Du Bois himself studied in Germany and, you know, was a Hegel scholar and, you know, got his PhD in a German university. Du Bois first went to a private college, to a black college, Fisk. And then after 2 years, he went to Harvard. He got his first degree at Fisk. Then he went to Harvard, and he got his, and then he had to redo everything because Harvard didn't recognize the classes he took at Fisk. And he graduated as the valedictorian of Harvard, the top student. And then he went to Berlin, and he in a letter, he reports with delight that Humboldt University in Berlin didn't recognize his Harvard classes. He's very happy about that. So you guys are on the side of this. These are all the connections between colonized people, between black Americans and Ukrainians. Like, all the omissions affect you too. You know, you guys get omitted from history. So Du Bois thought everybody should get a classical education. But then he gets criticized by Carter G. Woodson, who says, giving everyone this education of Plato to Kant, or whatever, tells them that they're not part of history. And think about women. What a classical education does about women. It says women have never contributed to history until like 30 years ago. You know, so a classical education. So what you find people saying, so the Du Bois Booker T. Washington debate, Du Bois is saying everyone should get a classical education. Booker T. Washington is saying forget Plato and Aristotle, everyone should just get an education for job skills. But really both are wrong. You need a classical education leaves out Eastern Europeans. It leaves out black Americans. It leaves out lots of, what? Leaves out, oh yeah, China's a place, right? Right, Asia. But there's only a few people there, right? Right, a million, right?
The rest of the world
except France, Germany, Britain, one Spanish person, Cervantes. Okay, so, and then the Nazis loved classical education. Now, I don't think that they thought about the concepts of classical education. I mean, there's no race in classical education, so, you know, but they elevated the classics to the level of nuclear physics. There was no other time in German history where there was so much money for the study of the classics as under the Nazis. Now, that's not to say that classical education is bad. I do think everyone would benefit by reading Plato. Hegel's like really hard and annoying. But I'm not saying, Plato is great, but the construction of a canon involves exclusion. The construction of an Eastern European canon has always involved excluding Ukrainians, just like the construction of an American canon has always involved the exclusion of black Americans. And all canons seem by their nature, a canon is like, these are the classic texts. And all of that, Toni Morrison says, so a canon is, these are the great texts of the civilization. That's what a canon is. And Toni Morrison says, a canon is part of national defense. It's like the army. And so with classical education, I think you have to say, like with nationalism, that, it's not that you should denounce it entirely, but there are versions of it that are very bad. And those versions are things that Ukrainians, when you're speaking to Ukrainians, they've suffered from the very concept of a classical, you have suffered from the very concept of a classical education in ways that if you're speaking to Germans, a German audience will be, I can see there are criticisms of classical education, but you can't deny that Kant and Hegel were the best. That's what they would say. Name some other philosopher who's the best. And since I've been trained in the West, I don't, okay. All right, let's talk now. You don't need to moderate. We can just, hand out. So, okay, well, let's start on the left. But you have to speak up.
My question could be considered a little bit provocative, but we've been talking a lot about education, and our Ukrainian educational program has been changed since the full-scale invasion, and the Russian literature has been excluded from our program. And the question is, do you think it's the still defensive nationalism from the Ukrainian side, like banning of the Dostoevsky, Bulgakov, and so on and so forth, or we are near to the fascism, like when we are hating Russian culture?
Right. I don't like that. This happened last year, that everyone was using this concept of defensive education, defensive nationalism, and I don't know why all of you say that, but it must be something that is in the literature. I don't really like that. That's not how I make the distinctions. What's the other one called that you guys all say? There's defensive and then the bad kind. What? Aggressive nationalism, right. I think you guys, I am trying in my work, I try to make a distinction between bad nationalism and good nationalism, but I don't call the good nationalism defensive, because that's sort of, to me, that's weird. Democratic nationalism, maybe, I don't know. Because defensive nationalism makes it seem like a wartime nationalism. And so, but I agree, aggressive nationalism is a good concept, a good label. I call it supremacist nationalism in my work. That is great, and I want that provocation. That's why I'm here. There's nationalism in wartime, and then nationalism once you win the war. And those two, as Fanon said, should be very different. I mean, I talked a little bit about Hamas. Like, Hamas is a horrific thing, like Hamas are murderous barbarians. But it is true that Palestinians have been denied a state. So you don't want a kind of nationalism in a war that results in anything like Hamas, who kills innocent civilians. So even in a war, there's unacceptable forms of nationalism. So you don't want, but there's no Hamas in Ukraine. That's not happening. No one in Ukraine is running over, some people are looking puzzled at me, but right. But you want to avoid that. You want to avoid that. That's the kind of structure. And furthermore, if you have that structure, if you look at Hamas in Israel, Netanyahu gave $1 billion to Hamas. Why did he give $1 billion to Hamas? because he wants to say all Palestinians are like Hamas. And, you know, he supported Hamas because then he can say, okay, they're all essentially like Nazis. And so if you create a bad form of nationalism when you're under conditions of war, then you're justifying the narrative about you that justifies the war. So what does Putin say? He says, Ukrainians are fascists, Ukrainians are anti-Russian, Ukrainians, you know, they kill Russian ethnic they kill Russian-speaking Ukrainians, you know, they ban the Russian language. You can be pissed off at the Russian language, which I understand you all are, but you don't want to feed into the very narrative that justifies the war against you. That's why, and just to, if you want to remember this, that's why Netanyahu funded Hamas. So he could say, they're all bad. So Putin would love it if Ukrainians became fascists. Because then he'd say, see? So it is absolutely essential not to fit into the propaganda that justifies the war against you. It's absolutely essential not to be Hamas, for people to recognize that Palestinians have been victimized and oppressed. They cannot endorse Hamas. Okay, we're going, you're next? Is that, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to make a few points. You said about nationalism, and previous one said also about defensive nationalism, and I'd like to... I don't like that word, defensive nationalism. Okay. I'd like to talk about a little more about it, because I think that there is a difference that you see as American nationalism and me as a Ukrainian, because for us it is a way to stand out of a Russian culture, and it is also a way to say that we're different, that we're who we are. And also you said that nationalism, good, fine nationalism, should be made up of facts. That's true, obviously. But every nationalism is a set of facts that are make some system. Like,
but also myths. Every nationalism relies on lies.
Yes, right. If we are starting to say that Khmelnytsky wasn't Ukrainian, he was like something like that,
yeah,
then our myth as Ukrainians
exactly.
are destroyed.
Exactly.
And we are no one, that we are something like that. And I think that is crucial for us now in the wartime to make our system, our nationalism, the way that we're standing out for Russians,
right.
over Polish.
Great point.
Also, and in that context, you said about classical education in West. We, I think, had their Russian classical, because if you are educated person in the Soviet Union, you need to know Pushkin, Lermontov, Dostoevsky,
right.
and so on and so on. And it is also kind of imperial, colonial politic of Russia, and we should be out of there, I think.
Yeah. But that's not to say, and I think this goes back to your point, that's not to say that Tolstoy was a bad writer. You know, excluding Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, look, good luck doing that. It's not going to work. People are, it's just like history. It's not going to work to erase history completely, because people lived through history and their kids are there and grandkids are there. So you can't erase Holodomor. You also can't erase the fact that Tolstoy was a good writer. People are not going to ever stop reading Shakespeare. But they could also read Shevchenko, or you can add without subtracting. But yes, I think that wasn't a question, it was a summary of what we've come through so far. Okay, I'm going to take this.
I'll try, okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Yuri Radchenko.
Welcome back from last year.
Yeah, hi, nice to see you. First of all, a lot of questions. I will ask one, a lot of stuff what I disagree with you. We will not discuss Hamas now and all this stuff as well. For me, it's a challenge, to call at least all of Jews white people. At least.
Well, I don't, well, that's obviously false.
Okay, don't worry, yeah. But my point is, my question is regarding stuff, it's like Koranization.
Like what?
Koranization. It's policy of Soviet regime in 1920s, 1930s, where it was implementation of local cultures, local nationalities, and so on and so on. This policy, it's considering now quite contradiction in modern Ukrainian and Russian and post-Soviet and all narratives. I begin to hate this word because it's we can hear it from our media. But anyway, how would you consider influence of this policy in creation of modern, let's say, Russian nationalisms? Because we didn't have one Russian nationalism, and Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian nationalisms as well. It's maybe national movements of another people, like Chechenians, Crimea Tatars, and so on as well. Yeah, thank you.
Can you ask that again? I didn't quite understand. I think I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I'm asking regarding Koranization, policy of Koranization.
Say that again?
Koranization. Okay, you are not specialist in Eastern European history. Okay, understand. What was the influence of this policy to creation of identities, modern, let's say, nationalism? Because in different narratives we have a different approach. This, for instance, such policy was stopped in 1932, but it's not. It's false. It's not true. It's continued until 1939. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Jason, you want to use the mic?
Okay, the Soviet Union did allow different nationalities and had a policy of allowing that. So what is your question about that?
My question is, what influence it has to modern
I see.
nationalism,
Great question.
Russian nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, and nationalism as well.
Right.
And Chechenian nationalism,
right.
Crimea Tatars.
Right, great. I've always wondered that myself, but don't you study this? Right. I mean, it's a great question. I've always wondered about that because, like, it was a shift, right, from early Soviet Union to then, I think my understanding that it was part of the Soviet Union's sort of decision to be anti-colonial and to ally themselves with anti-colonial movements. But, yeah, that's a great history. Do you have an answer to that question?
I have some answers because I'm doing studies of let's say, Karaite sector of Koranization in 1920s, 1930s in Crimea, because it was so-called indigenous people were proclaimed by Soviets, by the way, Crimea Tatars, Karaites, and Krimchaks in this region. And this policy is continuing such an ideological approach, who are indigenous, who are not indigenous in this region. And I think this policy had very strong influence still. And people, even people, when they are quite anti-Soviet, they don't understand that they use Soviet language when they said that we are for justification. I agree with it. It's okay. It could be 50. I say if it helps to reoccupy Crimea, I accept it. It's not. It's a question for me. It's a question of ideology, as you say. Identity. It's handmade stuff. You can accept it or not. It's okay, and don't worry. But I think it's quite interesting phenomenon when anti-Soviet people with anti-Soviet approaches use Soviet language when they try to justify their identity and existence. Yeah.
No, absolutely great. Part of the myths that are happening now is that the Soviet Union purely tried to extinguish all identities and it was a kind of Russian imperialism. And that's what Putin is doing too, because he's saying it's the empire part of the Soviet Union that I am continuing. But there's lots of parts of the Soviet Union that did promote differences in identity. And the Soviet Union has just become, and the Soviet Union wasn't just Stalin, it was also Gorbachev and Andropov, and who weren't like monsters.
Yeah, but the point is that in modern Russian, let's say, ideology, Putinist ideology, Koreanization accepts like an error, because it, according to this approach, gave option to these peoples, nations, to become nations. Ukrainians.
Exactly.
Without Koreanization, it wouldn't be Ukrainians.
Right.
Without it wouldn't be Belarusians and Chechenians and Crimea Tatars, etc., etc. This is
Right.
the point.
Right. The Soviet Union was the Soviet Union recognized these differences. Right. I think this was something we talked a lot about last year, is the conflation of Putin with the Soviet Union. Like, Putin is like better thought of as a Russian form of fascism than the Soviet Union, which was not.
Thank you. I think we need to move on to the next question.
Okay. So let's move.
Yes, I also want to continue the question of excluding Russian literature. And when I was covering this issue for one of the Western media outlets, a tiny one, and since I have a literature criticism education, I've spoken a lot to ex-colleagues, literature criticists, and they were also saying not only about this justification or defense or whatever, but also about the issue of a collective trauma. And Rostislav Semkiv, who is a literature criticist and an owner of a publishing house, he told me this thought that the kids, small kids, will not be able to understand that we are currently studying the poetry and the literature of the same nation that has missiles on us, and they will not be able to understand this concept. So better for it to be out of the program for maybe like a decade or maybe like a generation, and then return when we will become more mature, or maybe when the war would end, if it ends, and stuff like this. So my question would be how to balance between this healing of a collective trauma that might probably never stop, because we don't know for how long, maybe the war will be like for 20 years. And between balancing with this collective trauma and these innocence that may be created in this issue.
Because right now it's pretty undeniable that Ukraine are victims. By the way, there was a question. You had a question, right? Did you have a question? Yeah. All right. So that's just a hard question. I don't know if I can answer it. Again, Fanon talks about this. Fanon talks about nationalism under conditions of war versus afterwards. And you're losing the war if after the war ends, you take on exactly the bad features of nationalism that they said you had. But I'm not sure I don't know how to think about removing, should Black Americans not have read Shakespeare? That seems wrong. Even though they're being oppressed by whites. So, all right, she and then you, right?
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for being here again. First of all, I would like to clarify some things, because you mentioned the Red Army and language. And I would like to admit that Ukraine was forced to be a part of Red Army, and we had been forced long before the World War II started. And we were forced to speak Russian language, and we were persecuted even when we used Ukrainian language. So actually it was colonialism, but taking into account all the stuff you mentioned, how should we accept our Soviet past, or should we reject it at all? Especially now when, in terms of education, we, as colleagues mentioned, we have a lot of books and authors, Soviet authors.
So first of all, my understanding is that everyone was forced into the Red Army. It was compulsory. So Russians were forced into the Red Army. So, you know, in the Soviet Union, everyone was unhappy.
They weren't colonized. They
weren't. They weren't. They weren't. Yeah, that's a different point. Then
we were fighting against.
Well, but it's also the case that there were plenty of Ukrainians who thought that who accepted Soviet ideology. Again, Trotsky was Ukrainian, and so there were plenty of right. I mean, it's you can say that all Ukrainians who believed in the ideology of the Soviet Union weren't Ukrainian, but I don't think you should say that. I think
I didn't say
right.
that they weren't Ukrainians.
Right. Yeah. So there were plenty of. So there's a history of Russian imperialism, but the Soviet Union. I take it this was your point. What is your name again? Yuli. Your point was the Soviet Union's more complicated. It wasn't. It was. Yeah. It's clearly more complicated. And right, there were different periods of the Soviet Union. We could all accept that first of all, Stalin was a genocidal madman. My family had this story that my grandfather, when they decided to go east in 1940 rather than west towards the Germans, my grandfather said, Hitler hates the Jews, Stalin hates everyone. Better not to be singled out. Stalin is Georgian. He's not, I don't think the Soviet Union, I mean, I think this is the mistake that people make now, and you don't want people to make. It's complicated. You want to use that mistake sometimes, but not other times. That Putin is the Soviet Union. Putin is not the Soviet Union. It's a very different thing. He's like Hitler. So he, you could leave. Yuri Andropov, I'm sure, was kind of bad in various ways, but he wasn't Stalin. He was Yuri Andropov. I mean, Gorbachev was not. The Soviet Union had many different phases, even under, but the idea that Ukraine was always like purely a colonized nation by the Soviet Union is confusing to me. It doesn't seem historically accurate. It doesn't seem to be, I think the Red Army did great things in World War II, as well as bad things, and Ukraine doesn't help itself. Like, did you hear what happened in the Canadian Parliament a few months ago? That was bad. It lost support for Ukraine immediately. Everyone around me, haven't you noticed Ukraine sort of dropped? Someone was introduced in the Ukrainian parliament saying they fought the Red Army in World War II. To anyone in the West, that means that they were a Nazi. So what that was, for me as a lover of Ukraine, as someone who loves this independence struggle, that was a terrible moment. Because in the West, there are clearly terrible things that the Soviet Union did, but it's also the case that beating the Nazis is considered. They were allied with the United States, and Ukrainians were central to that effort. The Ukrainians were central. There was Ukrainian generals in the Red Army,
But you know that during the World War II, we were fighting against both of evils.
Do not ever say that in front of someone from the West, ever. Because people will
we were fighting for our independence.
If I say that to anyone in the West, they'll be like, why are you there? Because
a bunch of people were killed by Soviet
I know. But
we weren't ally of Hitler just because we want to, be
I know. Sorry. Can you, right. What? Yeah, it's just as advice, never say that. What happened?
My great-grandfather was killed because he was a part of Ukrainian.
Oh, the Holodomor, So Stalin killed millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians. However,
There is no however.
well, it's just that moment in the Canadian Parliament lost you the support of so many people. Yeah, who was introduced as fighting both the Red Army and what? Yeah. He was what? Yeah. He was brought in by, by the Ukrainian diaspora. And then as a result, it was everyone who was opposed to helping Ukraine just cited that again and again and again. So you're never going to win that battle. You're never going to win the battle of siding, you know, being neutral against Hitler was okay, you know, or like, yeah.
But Red Army
Okay, right.
also was allies with Hitler.
What?
Stalin was also ally with Hitler.
Oh, right, absolutely.
They started war.
Right. No, in Molotov, yeah, I'm not praising
Excuse
Stalin.
me, just to finalize this stuff was in Parliament, in Canadian Parliament, this from Ukrainian diaspora, they could invite not ex-member of Galicia, they could invite member, for instance, who fought in Canadian army, Ukrainian, because I have been in Canada many times and have seen that a lot of ethnical Ukrainians fought in, not in German army, but in Canadian army, not in Soviet army as well. They could do it politically correctly, but I'm sorry. I know different people from Ukrainian diaspora, and left and right and centrist, and a lot of good people there, majority of them, but some shit happens, sorry.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
I think we are going to have to move on to the
let's
next
move on.
question.
Okay, don't have a question, I just have a little objection about Russian literature and language. I was Russian speaker most part of my life because of my mother was from Moldova and so on. And I think that we have an issue here because Russians claims us as Russians, almost Russians, because we speak their language, because we read their literature, because we enjoyed something that was created in the USSR. And you have a privilege to live far away, enough far away from Russia to enjoy mystery Russian soul. And for now, we have a problem that because of the internet, our children have access to this content and they don't understand why. And we still have these people like that waiting for Russia or just can leak sensitive information to Russia and so on. I understand that it's hard to exclude something you used to. You used to think that this great literature maybe in some way it's made by a good way, but not that exact good things you told previously yesterday about that guy that have a lot of black offsprings. Tolstoy also had a lot of slaves offsprings by himself. And I think that in this case it's not so easy to divide this, that we need to include something with Russian origin. And I think the best, the most worst part of this, that Western obligated Ukrainians to be moral icon, to make only good decisions, and it's also childish position about that we need to be only good guys in case we lost the best of wise. And you don't study Ukrainian authors in classical education because they just been killed. They killed not only on the beginning of the Soviet Union, they killed during this time. And it was in 60s, it was in 50s, so when you just you just enjoy techniques, they enjoy Gulag. or they just end themselves because they can't exist in this ideology. And I think that it's a really childish position to tell us about how we should be.
No, I'm not suggesting you should be. This conversation was just about strategy. It wasn't about the topics of this course, and that's why we should move on. It was just about communication strategy with the West. That's it. It wasn't. I was not taking any position on, the Soviet Union was evil, the Nazis were evil, but communication. I would never tell Ukrainians how to design their education system. I'm not familiar with Eastern Europe. I'm familiar with the United States, mainly with and then I have a general theory of democratic education. What to do under conditions of war, how to do your education system when you're at war, I don't know. I mean, I view this conflict as a conflict between freedom and democracy and fascism. Like, for me, I have no connection to Ukraine as a country. Like, my connection is because I think the freedom struggle in the world is here. And so that's why I'm here. I'm not here because I believe Ukrainian folk dancing is better than Russian folk dancing or anything like that. I'm here because Ukrainian identity seems to me to be interlinked with democracy. And so, if Ukraine can win, it shows that democracy can win. But however you choose to run your nation is up to you. And however you choose to do your, I don't know Russian and Ukrainian authors. I don't know either of those, so I can't tell you what to. I mean, I have general views about classical education. My general views about classical education is even though Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Hegel weren't Jewish, I still like them. And Aquinas was Christian, and he's great. So.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
We really do need to
wrap it up. So tomorrow, I think I'm going to give a lecture on propaganda and disinformation, and not nationalism, classical education, the education topic. So this is going to be the end of this topic, of these topics about education, and I'm going to move to disinformation studies.
And in addition, Professor Stanley is going to have a major announcement. So we want you all to come tomorrow. This announcement is so explosive that they haven't even told me what it is yet. I'm not sure he's been told yet, but there will be a major announcement at the...
I am making an announcement that I don't know.
Yeah, it could be.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you. By the way, I like it when we conflict.
So let us please thank Professor Stanley once again for coming.
So I will see everyone.